three areas which will get the most
Yeah.
impacted by your tool.
Number one, autonomous generation.
Cool. Number two.
Two, auto balancing and live ops.
Yeah, sounds good.
Three, time saving.
Hi, in this video, we'll be able to listen to some of the guests which we invite to our weekly Mr. Metaverse discussion. It's an auto RPG, so I'm right now sharing the demo on YouTube, and we'll be having a creator of this tool, team. So please, team, share how this tool came to life and maybe some inside information which is not public. It'll be great to hear.
Oh, I love telling people secrets. All right. So first off, let's just introduce myself formally. So my name is Tim Cotten. I came out of the video game industry for the last 20 years. I've done all sorts of stuff. I started out as a player in the beta test of Ultima Online, and I joined the second generation of MMO developers after the first generation pretty much built all the original MMOs. So that's where I started my career at Electronic Arts. I eventually went on to other studios like Mythic, and they had Dark Age and Warhammer and a couple of others. You might know them as working with BioWare on Star Wars Online. And then I did gamification for a while, and then I got into blockchain. I did a lot of enterprise development and AI. And so what we're doing right now with my company Scrypted is saying, hey, we have 50 years of pre-deep learning AI systems that we embedded all over the gaming industry, right? Everything from Wigmorian decision networks with evidence-based reasoning to knowledge systems, expert systems, like all sorts of stuff. But they had this huge limitation. You really couldn't throw freeform data at them. You had to pre-process everything and perfectly format it, right? And now in the age of deep learning, where we have things like GPT, which by itself doesn't have any cognition, but has the ability to create very human-like responses and parse data. You can even go to GPT and throw it some text and say, hey, go turn this into a structured JSON schema, right? That unlocks a lot of the previous 50 years of AI. And so what we did with Auto RPG is I said, oh, I love RPG Maker. I made my first demo in RPG Maker. I should go and make a simple 2D tile-based system and demonstrate why GPT by itself can't do what you see in the video. Like, and there's a blog article, and we can post that in the channel. There's a blog article that explains what you get if you ask GPT itself by itself to
Is this the
design a
one
level.
about introducing auto RPG demo, or is it a different one?
Exactly. Yep, you got it right
I
there.
have it right now on
So
the
if you
screen.
read that article, fantastic. So that you'll notice that the picture of what GPT gives you, it just doesn't even understand what it's doing, right? Because it's a probabilistic like word token generator. That's what it does. It's really amazing. But on the other hand, it doesn't have any sense of self, right? But when you hook it into a harness of something like Baby AGI, which we heavily customized, that started out at 200 lines in the original project, and Yohei knows, like, I turned it into like 100,000 lines of our stuff, right? So once you hook all that up with modules, and also you give it the ability for other LLM models to see what you're doing with the original output, and you create a feedback loop, oh, you get cool stuff, right? So for instance, we have a model that we've been training to understand video and pictures from video games and break them down, right? So it can look at that 2D map and say, hey, I see a path. And then, of course, what does it do? It says, hey, I should probably write some A-star code for pathfinding so I can see if I can get from one side to the other. It'll generate the Python script for me, execute it in a sandbox. Now here's some secret sauce, right? I have our system making the ability to take code generated by GPT and customize it and react to what happens to it. And you end up with something like the video. You end up with something where it takes a role, right? It takes a role and says, hey, I'm going to make an NPC, pretend. It doesn't have the graphics for it. It just makes a pretend NPC and says, I'm standing on the western side of the map. If I were looking out over this map, and it has to look at it in chunks, it can't parse the whole thing at once. Is it interesting enough for me to leave the path? And it said no. And so the system goes, well, one of the goals is that the scene should be interesting. So it says, what can I do? So it puts strawberries on the farthest side of the map near the waterfalls so that a player, would be interested in walking off the path, going off the beaten path. I didn't have to program that behavior.
Side
I
quests.
only had to give it the tools, right? And that's where the magic comes in. And so auto RPG, that's just the world building is just the start. That's just the basics, right? Like, because let me tell you the biggest problem we have right now.
We just crossed 40 subscribers mark yesterday. If you like what you're listening right now, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. It takes a second for you to do it. It costs nothing, and it means a world to us. It shows us that we are moving in the right direction and we produce the right content. So thank you. Enjoy.
So, one thing I want to cover before I talk about the impact on industry, right, is people have asked me, well, didn't you just use the tools inside RPG Maker? And I said, no, no. What we did is we baked out all of the graphical tile data and all the relationships between the tiles, which are like auto tiling relationships, and did that. We didn't use any of the like tools inside of RPG Maker because, as my article shows, their proc gen stuff is well, it hasn't really gotten better over the last 20 years, and I do love RPG Maker, but most of the community has to rely on plugins, right? So anyway, all right. That being said, here's a situation for game developers, right? Even a non-AAA, even like someone who's just like an A, like a double A, or like maybe an indie, you spend $2 million, you spend a year working on a game. You really believe in it. You think you've got great documentation. You think you've got a great balance, right? You put it out there, and the player response just doesn't hit, right? Your KPIs, you're missing them. Something's wrong with your key performance indicators. So what do games normally do? Now, if you're a giant company, okay, whatever. You kill the game, you start over, you do something else, right? That's like the king philosophy. Doesn't work for everybody, right? Some of us actually have invested all of our time and money and souls into it, so we got to make it work. Well, you start adjusting levers, you start twisting knobs, you start changing numbers in an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. And when you really bake it down, it looks just the same exercise you do when you're training a neural network, right? You're just adjusting weights. You're just changing node, like the graph node relationships between each layer of the possible game state. And, my co-founders and I, we realized, why wouldn't we just train a game development model that doesn't just generate games or game designs or ideas, right, using GPT and other things in a harness? Why wouldn't we make a system that, if you give it the parameters of the game, can auto balance it or create evergreen content for live ops? And as someone who worked in the MMO industry and knew how hard it was to organize events with 20,000 to 200,000 players and keep fresh content constantly, I was like, oh, now I know why my product can be important, even though I'm just showing you the toy version right now, right?
Makes sense. And I'm curious, what is the major difference between this kind of generation of the world and story and between like a procedural, I think it's the right word, generation? So
Yes.
when the system, because it has been around for decades, right? So
Yeah.
what's like the
Yeah.
major
Absolutely.
improvements on that?
Yeah. So okay, let me walk you through it. First off, there's nothing wrong with procedural generation. Nothing. In fact, procedural generation has been become so advanced in many ways, like with Compton's tracery system, for instance. And she worked on The Sims and not Sims, yeah, Sims, and a couple of other things. So Spore, she's very famous for Spore. Um, ProcGen has kind of reached its maximum creative output. I wouldn't say like truly the maximum, but it's 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 reached that point where people are spending more time optimizing ProcGen methods than using them as tools. What AI can give you is an understanding of the procedural generation methods and then the ability to wield them in narrative as brushes, like paintbrushes on a canvas. For instance, what's the difference between a human painting and Midjourney, right? Midjourney starts out with pixels moving moving outwards and forming images, right? It continually recurses in its adversarial network until it generates an image pixel by pixel. Humans like to take a brush, dip it into some paint, and do a stroke. I like to treat procedural generation as the strokes now, right? We can say something with AI like, I want this narrative of having a hill on which there are strawberries growing. And then the narrative says, write me a story about it. And it says, I have an NPC that was walking along and loved the strawberries so much, Alara, and it named her Alara. I didn't have to name the NPC, that she decided to retire there and build a tavern with her boyfriend who had to go to war. And the king came and, it wrote this entire backstory, and then it broke it down into a JSON format for all the NPCs, the relationships with each other, and what items were important. And so not only did it just design the map, but it designed the content of words and quests that could be associated with it. Now, I'm sure as some of the game developers who are listening know, there's really only four kinds of quests, right? Kill, fetch, escort, that sort of thing. Now, what happens when you have really fun AI that's able to not just write the content, but able to handle the relationships between all of them? And so this is the difference with procedural generation, right? Procedural generation is really good at just creating mass amounts of content, but it looks the same and gets boring really quickly. You can just ask, like, the devs on Daggerfall, largest game world in existence, but most of it was empty and meaningless, right? AI gives you the ability to solve the communication problem, the complexity problem of when you have so many things happening, it's hard to actually balance the game. Now an AI can help you with that. It doesn't you don't have to give it full control. Why would you? But you can use it as a brush. And that's what I'm really excited about.
I see. Makes sense. I'm curious if there's any of the speakers would like to give a comment and ask any questions.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Could this be like, could the AI be used to almost like have certain personas that you create for your audience and like react with the different quests and like different to cater to them individually to make it like a more unique experience?
I love this question, Amy. You've already figured out here's what's funny. The demo that you're seeing was written by an AI harness with a persona mapped to the five-factor model of idealistic, right? So if you look at human um, attributes of their personalities and you break it down into like five or six major traits, we built a system that just defined all 32 possible combinations of like the binary not and absolutely of those, the yes and no's, and created 32 different types of AIs just to experiment with. And hilariously enough, not only does it work for the world building stuff, but it works for the NPCs, just like you're saying. So in this case, there was actually a bug in the code that caused the NPC that was generated to also be idealistic like the world builder instead of randomly choosing another one. But the result speaks for itself, right? It turned out that it was a really interesting result. When I put the apathetic world builder on it, here's the loop. The apathetic world building agent says, it has a prompt that starts out essentially as you have a 40 by 24 green field of green grass tiles. Is this aesthetically pleasing and should you do something to improve it? Now, the idealistic one says, well, this is boring. Let's go ahead and add some variety, some depth, some water, right? The apathetic one said, yeah, this is fine. It just left it.
Three areas which will get the most
Yeah,
impacted by your tool, basically,
yeah.
and why.
Okay, good, good, good. Okay, so I'm going to give you three. There are too many, so I'm just going to cut it to three.
Yeah,
So good
that's why
job.
I asked three. Yeah, so
Um,
just so
yeah,
we're focused on the
yeah.
primer one.
First, let's. The third one's going to be the most important. All right, but the first one I'm going to talk about is the difference between what we're going to call generative AI, right? What we have today, generative art even, and autonomous AI and autonomous generation of content, right? And so the most important thing that we're bringing to the table is the synthesis of generative art, generative techniques with deep learning and adversarial networks, and all of the structured logic and symbolic language interpretation of the previous 50 years of AI. What that means is if you go to today's versions of generative art for game programs, and I'll leave the competition names out, and you try to generate assets, for instance, to use in a tile-based game, you'll get stuff that looks kind of neat, but you actually can't just drop in and use because there's no real relationship between the art being made and your product, right? You're essentially just providing it images. You can even customize the tuning of those models with your own source files, but you're still not really templating anything. You're really not quite putting things together Lego style, right? I can give you that. That's what our system can do, right? And what you're seeing right now with that 2D demo, that's just the first expression. I'm looking very forward to showing off our generative art system that's built on top of this because it is so very different than what is currently out there. All right, number two, um, auto balancing. And what I mean by this is, and this is a problem time immemorial of all games, You put a lot of money and time into building a game. You have a lot of content, and then 6 months later, you need to do a patch and a content update. You're adding new classes, you're adding new features, all this sort of stuff. And what is the number one threat to your game? Unbalancing it, right? Suddenly you're hurting part of your existing player base in an attempt to retain those same players by adding new content. Now, this is an issue that can be solved either by massive playtesting, which is very expensive, right? And you really have to scale that. There are great solutions for that, right? Like Playtest Cloud does an amazing job with this, right? But what happens when you have AI agents that can play the game and start trying to figure out where the balances are for you? It's more than just an Excel spreadsheet at that point, right? You actually have agentic approach to live operations. That's really where our stuff's going to shine downstream. And then third, and this is the thing that I think people don't really anticipate as they're building their games. You try to save time by spending as much money as you can wisely. You might put it towards outsourcing, for instance. Anyone who has done outsourcing to any country or place that is more than a couple of hours away, right, has learned a very harsh lesson. And that is the feedback loop of providing a document to do, the execution of it, the return result, realizing that there's a missing specification or a feedback issue, spinning it back. You inject days and days of communication lapse in those moments, right? You can do your 10 p.m. East Coast meetings with someone that's in the Near East. You can do that. But most of the time, you're going to find that even the simplest change requires a full 24-hour loop. And when you stack that against a longer stream of development, it turns out that outsourcing can be one of your biggest blockers. Now, that's because we're not perfect and we can't make up all the specifications ourselves. So what happens when we massively shorten that iteration loop with AI, and a system like mine can be the 90% and then the 10% is finished by the professionals domestically? Well, suddenly you're maximizing the use of your time and money. You're saving your time, right? It's not cutting out the outsources completely. You probably always need some sort of studio that's assisting you if you're doing anything at scale. But when you can ideate quickly, and when you can iteratively like get that loop down to 20-minute segments or hour-long segments instead of 24 hours, yeah, suddenly there's a paradigm shift back towards the kind of game development that is speedy and doesn't get massively delayed. So I'll give you those three.
So for a summary, I'll ask you to answer in a way that I said three things, and a short, like a 5-word max.
Yep.
It's maybe like in one word, if you can think it would be perfect, like a summary as well.
I'll give you one. Number one, autonomous generation.
Cool.
2, auto balancing, right? Auto balancing and live ops.
Yeah.
3, time saving.
Thank you to watching to the end. If you like more exclusive content, you like the memes, or you'd like to learn through the text, consider subscribing to our newsletter. Links in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and probably you might like this video.